In this video of Florida Man Math, we're looking at another question from the r/learnmath subreddit. So the question is, an airplane is asked to sit within a holding pattern near Chicago O'Hare Airport. The function d of x equals 70 sine of 0.65x plus 160 represents the distance d in miles of an airplane from the airport at time x in minutes. So the first part, A, when the plane enters the holding pattern of x equals 0 minutes, how far is it from O'Hare? So this question is simply asking about how far the plane is at an input time for x equals 0. So all we have to do is just plug in x equals 0 wherever we see x in the d of x formula. So let's do that here. We need to do d of 0 equals 70 times the sine of 0.65 times 0 plus 160. So step by step, we have 70 times sine of 0 times 0.65 is 0 plus 160. And then the sine of 0 is itself 0. And finishing up, 70 times 0 is 0. So we're left with just 160. We need to make sure to equip this with units though, so this is 160 miles. So we have the answer for part A. So for part B, we have during the first 20 minutes after the plane enters the holding pattern, at what time or times x is the plane exactly 121 miles from the airport? So what we need to do is find when d of x is equal exactly to 121 miles. And now this is going to occur possibly for multiple times x. So we just need to replace d of x with what it equals. So the function is 70 sine of 0.65x plus 160 is set equal to 121. So we're trying to get x by itself. So let's first subtract 160. And we have to do that to both sides. So we have 70 sine of 0.65x is equal to 121 minus 160 is negative 39. So now we're trying to get x by itself. We need to divide both sides by 70 to cancel this out. And so we have sine of 0.65x is equal to negative 39 over 70. And this is approximately equal to negative 0.557 with some decimals. So this is a good place to make a checkpoint, because if you want to isolate x, what you have to do is take the arc sign. And so there's some caution you have to do when you do inverse trig. But let's do that anyway. Let's take arc sine of both sides. And these will cancel out like we needed them to. We have 0.65x is equal to arc sine of negative 39 over 70. So getting x by itself, we can divide by 0.65 on both sides. And finally, we have arc sine of negative 39 over 70 all over 0.65. 0.65 is the fraction 13 over 20. So because we're dividing by it, we could also represent this as 20 over 13 arc sine of negative 39 over 70. And as I mentioned before, when you're dealing with inverse trig functions, you have to be careful because sometimes they can have repeated values because the original trig function is periodic. So in this case, it's probably safer to use a graphing calculator at this checkpoint when you're only dealing with the original trig function. So let's take a look at the graphing calculator. Okay, so I've plotted both of these functions, sine of 0.65x and y equals negative 39 over 70. And the reason is because we're going to use that checkpoint equation to figure out where do they intersect. Now, none of these have particularly nice values, so we're just going to report numerically. So we can just go along and see that the sine curve and this constant curve within this interval for the first 20 minutes. So that's from the origin here all the way over to 20. They have roots here, 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 and here. So the x value is what we want, and we can just label that R1, R2, R3, and R4 to indicate 4 different roots. That way we're not writing all the messy decimals. So we basically have the answers now for part B. We can just report rounding to the nearest tenth of a minute. X is equal to 5.7, 8.8, 15.4, and 18.4 minutes, respectively. So that would be the answer for part B, which wants to know when is the plane exactly 121 miles from the airport. So going back up to part C, this question is identical because it's asking in the first 20 minutes, at what time or times is the plane, instead of exactly 121 miles, it's more than 121 miles. So this turns out to be a useful checkpoint because instead of an equals here, all we have to do is interpret when this is greater than. So for the graph, that means for part C, we're looking at this equation. Sine of 0.65x is strictly greater than negative 39 over 70 in the context of this interval for the first 20 minutes. So what that means is when is the graph just higher than this constant line? So the point of interest here would be 0 to R1. It's not higher in between R1 and R2, but it is higher than the constant line in R2 to R3. And it's not greater than between R3 and R4, but it is between R4 and the endpoint of this interval, which is 20. So this was the answer for part B. And the way we can characterize the answer for part C is probably best as an interval by saying x is an element of 0 inclusive up to R1, which is 5.7, and not inclusive here. Union that with this next interval, R2 to R3, so that's 8.8 to 15.4, not inclusive. Union that with the final interview, R4, which is 18.4, up to and including 20. So altogether, there's 3 different intervals for which the plane is greater than 121 miles from the airport. Alright, if you like this video, please subscribe to Florida Man Math, and as always, thank you for watching.